start off with period 4 this time, and next time we'll do period 5. And so it begins with the Age of Jefferson. Jefferson was an intellectual and a curious man. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was also the founder of the Republican Party. And so what you need to know about Jefferson is that his Republican Party was very, they advocated for strict construction, meaning they directly assume powers from the Constitution, which ends with his purchase of the Louisiana Territory. And he has a lot of issues with the judicial branch at this time, the Marshall Court system, because John Marshall was appointed by John Adams, and he was a Federalist. And so there were no Republicans really on the Supreme Court, and this really upsets Jefferson. So there's a lot of issues between those two. His first term is magnificent. He buys Louisiana Territory. He fights the Barbary pirates, who were impressing the ships, and and with the passing of the 12th Amendment, he was able to choose his own vice president without having to have his running mate be his vice president, like Aaron Burr, who was a maniac. So, yeah. And then there's his second term wasn't so great. He tried creating a new system of economics, and it failed miserably. And then after him is Madison, and then the War of 1812 in Madison. So his second term is in 1812, and Madison becomes president in 1813, and war was declared in 1813. And it's very funny that it's called the War of 1812 because it actually began in 1813. I don't know why it's called the War of 1812. It began in 1813. Madison was the one who declared war when he stepped into office. Jefferson did not want to declare war at all, which is one of the reasons why he was he was a failure in his second term. A lot of people expected. So there was Lewis and Clark expeditions. You don't really need to know about that. Just know that he was that he sent them off. People thought it was like a private journey or something like that. They came back. One of them committed suicide. I forgot which. The other one was really sad. And yeah, Sacagawea. Or Sacagawea, however you want to pronounce her name. So Madison, War of 1812. So the War of 1812 is important because it signifies the end of the Federalist Party with the Hartford Convention. So the Battle of New Orleans basically was a huge morale booster for patriots. There was a lot of patriotic sentiment, and this leads to the Era of Good Feelings later on, which only lasts about 8 years, but it's still very important. So the War of 1812 basically forces Britain to recognize American sovereignty, and it pulls out all the British troops since they didn't leave before. They still control part of Maine, and they still have the Oregon Territory, but that's about it. So Jefferson also passed the Embargo Act. He also tried to pass the Non-Intercourse Act. Both of these were like attempts to not have to deal with the war with France. War with Britain, my bad, which happened anyways with the War of 1812 under Madison because he was fed up with it, even though it's not really the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 is important. Just remember that it leads to the end of the Federalist Party with the Hartford Convention, and Battle of New Orleans is a huge morale booster for patriotic sentiment, leads to the Era of Good Feelings. So this Era of Good Feelings is basically like this boost in nationalism during this time period from 1817 to 1824, only about 7 years. And it's so called this because there was only one party at this time. There was only the Republican Party because of the end of the Federalist Party after the Hartford Convention. There was really only the Republican Party, and Monroe became president after Madison. Monroe Doctrine, basically, remember what the Monroe Doctrine is? Basically saying stay out, telling European empires to stay out of America or we'll fight you, and we're basically trying to prevent a future American empire, which of course fails. And so there's also John Marshall in the Supreme Court. McCulloch versus Maryland sets up necessary and proper clause. Marbury versus Madison sets up judicial review. Gibbons versus Ogden sets up the Commerce Clause, basically allows the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. And then also know the Missouri Compromise, which is very important. in the Civil War because it marks a physical line, a boundary between slave states and free states. And this leads to a free soil movement in the North, which we'll learn more about in period 5. Also, Missouri is above this parallel that separates the slave and the free states, and that's an issue, of course. But Maine gets indoctrinated as a free state, so it levels out. So that sets the precedent for so that when one slave state or one free state is admitted, there has to be another slave or free state to balance it out in Congress. It's all about representation in Congress. It's not really about slavery. It's about representation in Congress over the issue of slavery. So sectionalism is also a major part of this era. There's a lot of sectionalist tensions in this time period between the North and the South and the Midwest, of course. So there was the American system set up by Henry Clay, who never dies in this time. Who never dies from period 4 to period 5. He does not die. He's the compromiser of U.S. history. And so there was, the North became way more industrialized. The West got set up with Henry Clay's American system, which called for national internalization of internal improvements, connected the North, South, and West, and linked the economies, and as well set up a charter for the Second Bank of the United States, which was a regulatory agency. There were also tariffs to protect industry, which benefits the North, and transportation improvements for canals and roads, which also benefits the North and the West as well. The Far West was not talked about in this time period. Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party. So this is the Republicans, Democrats, and Seneca Falls, because 1800 is the start of the Jeffersonian Republican election, and Seneca Falls, which is in 1848, which marks the end of period 3. Again, period 4 starts in period 4, my bad, marks the end of period 4. Period 5 actually starts at 1844. So periods can actually can actually overlap. We have the start of the forming of the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party actually dies at this point because there's too much separation between the ideas of the Jeffersonian Republican Party. And so these Republicans switch over to Jackson's side after John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams happens in 1824. It's known as the corrupt bargain because Henry Clay did not want Andrew Jackson to become president. Instead, but he actually wanted to become president, but he wasn't able to, and he wanted to support more industry. And didn't want Andrew Jackson to become president, so since he was the Speaker of the House, he was able to set up a deal with John Quincy Adams, and he became president. John Quincy Adams became president, and this is known as the first corrupt bargain. And so we have John Quincy Adams becoming president, and then John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson run against each other again in 1828. Jackson wins, and Jackson serves 2 terms, and so Jackson's whole shebang is fighting the bank. And he also represents the common man, right? So this time period leads to more rights and equality for the common man, people who are middle class, so people who are middle class don't really know how to read or write all that well, can now participate in politics just as much as people could have, because previously the only people who participated in politics were very knowledgeable, intelligent people who have gone to college, when now, under Jackson, he changed the system so that anyone really can vote, especially those yeoman farmers that Jefferson loved. And so he became basically the representation of the common man, and his whole thing during his presidency was fighting the bank. He wanted to destroy the second bank. He hated the bank. He thought it was this huge national conspiracy that was going to challenge the federal government. A lot of people called him King Andrew for being for doing all his veto powers, and also ignoring congressional laws, and also passing a law saying that basically passing a military enforcement law against South Carolina, which South Carolina nullified in the nullification crisis with John C. Calhoun, who is, John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun got John C. Calhoun in that case, with the nullification crisis, Henry Clay, of course, comes up with the compromise, which is known as the Compromise Tariff of 1833. And so the whole nullification crisis happened because of the tariffs that were passed to support industry. Jackson actually didn't. So Henry Clay didn't realize this, but Jackson actually supported industry. He didn't really care all that much for industry. In fact, he just wanted to support the common man. And since the common man actually was going towards industry, he supported the passing of tariffs. And so these tariffs upset the South because they didn't want to have to pay tariffs, because they just wanted to deal with, they just wanted to work with their cotton, which actually has boomed now in the South, cotton, because of the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1797, and this has allowed for King Cotton to occur in the South. And so we also have the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. After Jackson's presidency, Jackson ends the bank, of course, and this leads to the Panic of 1837 under Martin Van Ruin. Yeah, and so then there's also the Mexican-American War, and in 1844 to 1848, which is in period 5, but you should also know that that happens in 1844 to 1848. 1848 is the Seneca Falls Convention. 1844 is the election of James K. Polk. 1840 is the election of, I think it was Millard Fillmore, or Zachary Taylor. No, it was William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, and then Tyler became president because Harrison died after giving such a long speech, and he died of pneumonia. So, yeah. And so this marks the end of this period, 1800 to 1848. And there's also the also remember that there's the Texas Independence Movement in 1836, but it doesn't become a state until 1844 under James K. Polk. And now we're done with period 4, and we can move on to period 5, which is the Civil War and Reconstruction, as well as Manifest Destiny.